So good evening, everybody. Can you hear me back there? Okay. Thank you for coming. My name is Rhoda Shermer, and I want to welcome you on behalf of the Network for Responsible Public Policy. We have a very interesting and timely program tonight, but I want you to bear with me because I have a few thank yous. And one of the thank yous is to all of you for helping to keep us going and to continue providing education programs. So your donations are supporting education, and we greatly appreciate that. And it's making possible our next two programs, which I hope to see you at. Our October program is going to cover the issues of gerrymandering and also voter rights. And our November program is going to cover all the complex issues surrounded with money influence. So those are two good programs to look forward to, and I thank you for helping to support them. I also want to give a special thanks to our co-sponsors, and that is the League of Women Voters of Northern Valley, and they did a good job of doing some voter registration tonight. They do a great job with that. And I want to also thank Jolt of Ridgewood and Women for Progress. All have helped us with their co-sponsorships. And now we can move on and get the program rolling. And I want to introduce you to our issues coordinator, Peggy LaScala, and she'll start the program and also introduce you to our speakers tonight. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'd like to introduce the speakers for tonight's program. Can you hear me? Okay, I guess you can't hear me. All right, better. Thank you. Okay, I'd like to introduce, this is Nicole Galinas. Nicole is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute. She's a contributing editor of City Journal and a columnist with the New York Post. She writes on urban economics and finance, and she's the author of After the Fall, Saving Capitalism from Wall Street and Washington. Right here on my right is Tamara Drought. Tamara is the Vice President of Policy and Research at Demos. She's the author of two groundbreaking books, Sleeping Giant, How America's New Working Class Will Transform America, and Strapped, Why America's 20 and 30-somethings Can't Get Ahead. Our moderator tonight is Peter Coy. Peter is the economics editor of Bloomberg Business Week. He writes on a wide range of economic, social, and financial issues, and he's a regular contributor to the magazine's Remarks column. Okay, thank you. Are we gonna start this?
Yeah, I'll start by just throwing some questions.
Excellent, thank you.
Thanks to y'all for coming. We have two really great speakers tonight, and I'm hoping that you'll be saving up some questions for them for once we get to the Q&A part. So be thinking what you want to ask. It's going to be a wide-ranging conversation between us, between the three of us, with the audience, and so it's going to be fun. And I'm going to start with Tamara. This is all about government, the role of government. Tell me, I think Ronald Reagan, among others, said that government is not the solution, government is the problem. What do you make of that?
Yeah, we've been living through, I think, about a generation of really a pretty concerted effort to attack the role of government in society. And I think, first, let's be clear about what we mean when we say government. I think a lot of people tend to conflate elected officials with government. And to me, government is basically the mechanism in which we get things done for society that we can't do for ourselves. And so I think of the role of government as fulfilling kind of three basic functions: investing, protecting, and building. And I like to hearken back to what I would call one of our country's greatest inventions. Anybody know what one of our country's greatest inventions was? What'd you say? Well, the internet's a good one because government-funded research did help spark the technology that gave way to the internet. But it's the middle class. I actually think the middle class is one of the greatest inventions of the United States. And the middle class didn't just happen. It was actually built, and built largely by government and public investment. If you think about the foundations of the post-World War II recovery and the big economic expansion, You have the building of the National Highway System. You have the GI Bill, which helped, for the first time ever, many people become homeowners and get college degrees. And you had this huge economic expansion. You had widely shared prosperity, something that's never happened in my lifetime. Look at the age of the audience, so maybe some of you can remember a time when incomes at the bottom were growing as fast as incomes at the top. I can't actually wrap my head around that being something that happens in the United States of America, because during my whole life, it's actually been the top 1% pulling away from the middle class, and particularly the bottom 90% of Americans. So to me, government is not the problem. In many ways, we need government more than ever to solve some of our most pressing critical challenges, and I would put climate change among them. So I have a lot more to say about the important role of government, but that's my basic philosophy.
Okay, great. And I'm going to throw it to Nicole now. You talked beforehand about how government has a role, but where does the government's role begin and end? Tell me where you come down on that.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Tamara. And thank you all for coming this evening. The two natural disasters that we saw over the past 3 weeks illustrate what government does well and what government does poorly. In Hurricane Harvey, the government had an unsung success in that damage, death, destruction were certainly there and tragic in the case of the deaths and injuries that did occur, but they were much lower than they could have been. And why is that? It's because of a government investment that was made 70 years ago. After bad flooding in Houston in the 1920s and 30s, Houston, actually not Houston, but the Federal Army Corps of Engineers built 2 dams to protect downtown Houston and Houston's then existing neighborhoods from flooding. The Barker and Addicks dams worked as they were supposed to in that they protected downtown Houston from flooding, they protected older neighborhoods, and they protected the hospital complex and other critical infrastructure, which gave Houston a place from which to start rebuilding the rest of the city. So this is an example, and by the way, before Hurricane Harvey, the Army Corps of Engineers, which still controls the dams, has estimated that having these 2 dams there had saved Houston more than $10 billion in flooding costs over the previous 70 years. And so this is an example of what government should do: build and maintain public infrastructure that everybody can use and that everybody benefits from. But this is also a government failure. And why is that? Because Houston and the federal governments have not kept up these investments as the population has grown. Back in the 40s, when these dams were built, Houston's population was 400,000. Today, it's 2.3 million. And so the reason we saw flooding in outlying Houston neighborhoods is, first, they weren't there when these dams were built. There was nothing to protect. And second, it's even worse than that because these neighborhoods were designed to take the spill off from the floods. When the dam fills up, the Army Corps releases water into what used to be swampland and at most very, very lightly populated neighborhoods. Today, these are heavily populated middle-class neighborhoods, but yet because the government hasn't kept up with its infrastructure investment, they suffer in these types of events. Now, something the government shouldn't have done, and partly what also makes the damage from a storm like Harvey worse, is federal flood insurance. The National Flood Insurance Program subsidizes people to live in very risky areas that repeatedly flood, and is in effect a program that encourages people to live in harm's way. And I'll leave the start at that, and we can pursue that further if you like later in the discussion.
Yeah, Nicole, I really agree with what you said. I did a cover story for Bloomberg Business Week, which sent around to some people, kind of making some of those same points, and that the 2 reservoirs you mentioned were essential. It turned out that because they were overtaxed, the Corps had to deliberately release water, and so the parts of Houston that are flooded now are ones from which the Corps is continuing to release water even after all this time, because it needs to get the water levels down, and it needs to release pressure on the dam itself so that they don't rupture, which tells you that they did a good thing in the 40s, but they should have continued with that. There probably ought to be more flood control reservoirs in Greater Houston, but there's a huge pushback, and it takes a very strong will for the government, which really means the people, which means all of us, because we are collectively the government, to stand up to the pressure from, say, developers who want to make money by building in harm's way. Tamara, do you have any thoughts about the specifically the hurricanes?
I want to, no, not specifically about the hurricanes, but I want to try and get an actor in here, because we keep talking about, well, government didn't keep up the investment. There's an actor at play here. There's a reason that you hearken back to the 1940s. You know, it used to be that government, people thought of themselves as benefiting from government. White people saw themselves as beneficiaries of government. You had broad public support, and people were willing to take the deal that their taxes paid for those kinds of public investments, right? You had Oliver Wendell Holmes, the Supreme Court Justice in 1927, say, you know, taxes are the price we pay for a civilized society. Flash forward to today and the last sort of generation of political debates, which have really been about, let's starve the beast. You know, you have a political ideology whose very purpose is to shrink government, in the words of sort of the hero of this movement, Grover Norquist, till it's small enough to drown in the bathtub. And part of winning that fight to shrink government until it's down to a size you can drown it in the bathtub has been about changing the perception about who benefits from government. And this is a very famous, I'm not making this up, it's been well documented, it's called the Southern Strategy. And it was used to begin saying we can chip away from this activist support for government, which conservatives have never really wanted to see happen. They saw it as an intrusion in the free market. They want government out of the business of governing the economy. And so what you have is a strategy to begin saying, after the Civil Rights Act, when women got a seat at the table, when people of color got a seat at the table and became eligible for jobs and benefits that previously they weren't eligible for, political strategists said, aha, what we need to start doing is showing that government is helping those people at the detriment of these people. And those people were primarily people of color, and the people who were now paying for government benefits that used to benefit themselves were now just benefiting people of color. And let me put a really important political point on this. So in Lyndon Johnson, who sort of personifies activist government, right? Great society, all of that. Passing the Civil Rights Act, was the last Democratic president to win the majority of white support. There has not been a Democratic president to win the majority of white votes since 1964. The use of strategic racism to undermine the role of government has been a deliberate political ploy that not only has hurt all of us in terms of us not investing in things like climate change, our schools, our universities, our healthcare, but it's also created a rage that we now see, where today we have the reality that white people think bias against whites is more of a problem than bias against black people in this country. We have fueled anti-government sentiment by quietly sort of stoking some flames of racial resentment and using that to deregulate industries, to cut taxes, and we are all, white, black, and brown, the worse off, because our civilized society is really suffering, from health to educational attainment, to poverty rates, to maternal mortality. On almost any indicator, we are suffering because we are not investing in ourselves and in our future.
Nicole, do you feel that we, the United States as a society, is sort of underinvesting in public goods?
Sure, and there's a factor as well that fits into discouraging people from wanting to see the government do things like build transit, for example, or build infrastructure like dams, which is government incompetence, both perceived and real. And there's a good example of that right here in New Jersey, where I'm sure, as all of you are aware, Governor Christie, to get revenge on a mayor who wouldn't support his reelection bid, it stopped traffic going over the George Washington Bridge from the Fort Lee on-ramps. And this caused many, many years of scandal, and you know the whole story. I don't have to explain it to you. But one of the responses to this was, because Christie is corrupt and because Christie loaded up the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey with patronage employees, and because he so perverted this process and took a public authority and used it not to help people and not even to just be neutral toward people. I mean, many politicians of both parties don't care about infrastructure until something bad happens. But Christie was worse than that, in that he used a public authority to actually put people in harm's way and put people in danger. And it's kind of important because this is the same public authority that is in charge of our 3 airports. I mean, every single day they are responsible for tens of thousands of people's lives. And so for the governor to casually prod them into using their public assets to hurt people is kind of a big deal. But one answer to that is, well, the Port Authority must be failing, and so we should invest less in these public assets, because look what we did with them when we had the opportunity to do this. But there are certain things that government has to be responsible for. There's a lot of corruption and wrongdoing and so forth in the defense agency, for example. But you rarely hear anyone say, well, we don't run defense very well, so we shouldn't have defense. Let the private sector do it. That's just not an option. It's imperfect. People can take advantage of it. But you just have to slog through and try to do a better job and get better politicians if necessary in some instances. This is a core government job, and so when the government fails, there's no choice but to make the government do better. And this is, excuse me, so this is one way in that pointing to the government and saying the government is incompetent, therefore we can't invest money in our bridges and our tunnels and so forth, is a dangerous development over the past 30 years. And this goes from, there are many examples. I mean, Katrina, an example of government incompetence. But what did we do after Katrina? We made the government perform better, and we've seen the results of that in the storms that have occurred since Katrina. Not perfect comparisons, because that was a much worse storm than Harvey or Irma. But FEMA has gotten better at its job because it had no choice. No private sector entity is going to come in and do this job because FEMA and the rest of the government failed. And so I believe in the private sector. I think the best thing for the private sector is for the government to do its job and stay out of what are the private sector jobs. But to do that, you need to know what are the limitations of the private sector. The private sector is not going to build money-losing public infrastructure such as dams, roads, bridges, and tunnels.
Well, anybody who didn't know your bios would say, wow, these 2 women agree on so much. They're like peas in a pod here. And actually, it's actually quite impressive to me that there is a kind of a real core of things that you do agree on. But just to make trouble, I'd like to explore a little bit ways in which you don't agree with each other. So, I mean, you know each other's work a little bit. Where are the differences? I mean, I'll just pick one, for example. One of the core functions traditionally of government is education. Nicole, you've written about, in the City Journal, certainly has written a lot about charter schools and, private schools. Where should we be drawing the line between the government's role versus the private sector's role in, say, education, K through 12?
Sure, and I'm not a big fan of superficial disagreements. I mean, much of what people talk about on TV and so forth, on a big, high level, it's easy to disagree because you don't know or care about the details. It's where the details of things that come into play, which there's usually a lot more agreement on as you get lower down and actually have to try to accomplish these things, that it gets easier to agree. And on education, of course, K through 12 and pre-K through 12 education is a core government job. No private sector entity is going to do this universally for free. Of course, wealthier people can always pay for private schools, and church groups will do this and did it in the segregated South and so forth. But as a universal entitlement, only the government can provide this. But how should the government do it? I'm not an education expert. I mainly do my infrastructure and fiscal issues, but I'll venture a few thoughts. Is that this is a portfolio. Government runs public schools. Where it can do that well, it should, and in many instances it does. Where it hasn't, and where trying to do top-down public schools hasn't worked very well and made many voters desperate, including many minority voters in New York City, desperate to try something else. Doing well-managed, well-governed charter schools, which are publicly funded public schools, as competition to the traditional public school system, has worked out well in a place like New York. Now, there are good charter schools and there are bad charter schools. There are good charter school systems and bad charter school systems. You can read about examples in states where the state doesn't govern them adequately. It sets the financial incentives wrong. Too many schools are competing for too many children. There's focus on the wrong things, which is not just providing a good education. So this gets back to the point, which is that you can never get away from having competent government. A competent government can run public schools by itself, or it can competently oversee a network of charter schools, or it can do both those things, as New York City, with more than 1.1 million school children, has ample resources to do. But it's not as binary as saying, oh, government is incompetent, we should have charter schools. If your government is incompetent, you're going to get bad, corrupt charter schools. You're not any better off than you were.
Interesting point. Tamara, you have thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, I send my daughter to public school in Brooklyn. I went to public schools. I got my undergrad at a public university. So I clearly really believe that investing in human capital is actually one of the fundamental things that government should do and does well when given the resources to do it well. I'm particularly interested in where we haven't been investing compared to other nations, and it's at actually the bookends. It's at infant and toddler care, and it's higher education. And if you look at our peer countries, from Japan to Switzerland to Canada to France, we are the only nation that really has not adapted to the new economic and cultural change that women work and women with kids work, whether they want to, have to, need to, or all of the above. We're the only nation on this planet that doesn't provide paid family leave. The only developed nation that doesn't offer that as a fundamental right to people in their country. We're also way behind in developing high quality, affordable childcare. We're actually still far behind. We're like 27th in the world in just getting 3 and 4 year olds in pre-K. And then you look at higher education, where the lion's share of funding for public universities comes from states. When states hit financial problems during a recession, higher ed is easy to cut because tuition can go up to make up the difference. But what we're seeing is that we're not investing even in flush times in higher education. So what used to be possible, working a summer job, paying tuition, not going into debt, a generation and a half ago, is no longer possible at a state university. As a result, I would say, if you look at how America fares in the world in terms of college attainment, we have the world's best educated old population. We are number 1 among the world in citizens 65 and over with college degrees. Among 25 to 34-year-olds, it fluctuates. It's anywhere between 13th and 15th, depending on the year. That's not an accident. That's actually public policy. We had a major commitment to making higher education more affordable in this country. It started with the GI Bill. We expanded it in the Higher Ed Act of 1965. Pell Grants used to cover 3/4, 3 out of every $4 needed to cover the cost of college, including books, room and board, and food and such. Today it covers 1/3. So tuition has well outpaced inflation, and the main trigger for those tuition increases is that states have really pulled back their funding of higher ed, shifting the burden of paying for college onto students and their parents, who are primarily now doing it by taking out 5 figures of student loans. So I think human capital is a major area where our government, compared to our competitors around the world, is actually way behind, and that we need to be doing a lot as people in our communities to say that these need to be part of our new social contract, because we are falling way behind in suffering a lot of consequences in terms of economic well-being, health outcomes, literacy rates among kids entering kindergarten, you name it. We have a lot of human capital investment that we need to be making.
I want to exercise my prerogative as the moderator to bring all of you in as moderators and give you a chance to ask questions, give your thoughts. This doesn't mean that we're wrapping up with these speakers. They have a lot more to say, but I want to keep this interactive. So, Rhoda, do you want to deal with how people ask questions, or how do you want to handle that? While people are thinking about their questions, I'm going to keep asking questions because I don't want to have a lull here. One of the the good things about this organization, and Rhoda gets a lot of credit for this, is that it's always looking for solutions. And the solutions are a lot harder to identify sometimes than the problems. So I'm going to ask both of you, what would you actually think is a doable solution that would make things better? Not a pie-in-the-sky idea like what you would love to see in the ideal world, but what actually could be done? I'll start with you, Nicole.
I think one easy answer is that we need better infrastructure. And Trump proposed $1 trillion infrastructure program way back during the campaign. This seems to have disappeared along with a lot of other large-scale initiatives, whether it's the tax reform or healthcare. I don't know if you want to call it reform or not, but the big legislative achievements that he wanted to get done this year. But infrastructure, unlike some of the other issues, including taxes and healthcare, everyone can agree we need infrastructure. It does create jobs in the short term, but more important, it creates jobs and improves economic productivity in the long term. That when people talk about infrastructure jobs, they often think about construction workers and engineers, and that's certainly good. But the bigger point in creating jobs is that if I can shave 10 minutes off of a commute to Manhattan, then I've got extra time that I can be economically productive, earn more money, or extra leisure time, which is also important and has a financial value. And predictable, consistent commutes make people happier and able to get more done at work. If you've spent an hour and a half trying to take the train into work, when you get there, you're frazzled, you're upset, and you're not going to do a very good job. Your employer is not getting their money's worth out of you that day. So upgrading our infrastructure, particularly the rail infrastructure in the New York, New Jersey region, this is something that everyone should be able to agree on, and getting it done would give us economic benefits for decades.
Well, how would you go about doing that, though? Let's stick with the Trump plan was to mobilize private money by providing tax credits. Does that strike you as being a good plan?
Well, as with many things Trump, we don't know enough details to know whether it's good or bad, and that in itself is, of course, bad. But yes, from what little that we know, and these fact sheets go back to before the election, Trump wanted to spend $200 billion in federal dollars, and it mobilized the other $800 billion, so it would be $1 trillion infrastructure plan. First, that means there's a lot less there than meets the eye. First of all, the government is already spending $50 billion a year in federal money on infrastructure. This money doesn't go very far, and there are 50 states. If you think about how far $1 billion goes in this state on infrastructure, it doesn't go very far. Trump was going to add to that, so it wasn't a new $1 trillion. It was more like a new $600 billion or so over half a decade. But again, if you're going to use private sector money to galvanize infrastructure investment, the problem with that is that infrastructure that can be funded by the private sector is already funded by the private sector. We have private electricity systems in much of the country and here in New York and New Jersey, for example. Why is that? Because people pay their electric bill. You have a strong incentive to pay your electric bill. For that, you get infrastructure, which is power. Same thing with water and sewer utilities. Sometimes these are run by government bodies, but they do pay for themselves. You pay your water and sewer bill, this pays for the infrastructure. These things, they need regulation so that they're not monopolies, but they pretty much run themselves without a lot of heavy government interference. The things that don't pay for themselves, and another thing that pays for itself is airports. You'll often hear, oh, we need to invest in the airports. LaGuardia is a third world airport, and Cuomo finally did start doing that. But the airports generate a huge profit. The Port Authority will make a $500 million profit this year from the 3 airports. They fund themselves. Airline passengers fund these airport upgrades. That's why it's easier to do these things.
What subsidize the PATH train.
Right, which is important. And what doesn't fund itself is the harder problem, a new tunnel under the Hudson River to replace the Amtrak tunnel that's 111 years old now, better subway systems. These things don't pay for themselves, and they need an enormous amount of public investment. And I'm not sure that Trump understands that because he comes from the real estate sector. I think he thinks of infrastructure as something like a building, which is not really infrastructure. It's what's under the building that is the infrastructure. But presumably somebody, Elaine Chao is his transportation secretary. She is a competence veteran of Washington, and she should understand that. It's just a matter of, are they brave enough to tell this to Trump, and will Congress go along with a real public infrastructure plan? But the short answer is you need public dollars and subway systems and so forth. You cannot get away with not doing that.
So to me, Peter, your question is a political question, not a policy question.
Okay.
I actually think this is all political questions because, I'm convinced even just after like 10 minutes, Nicole and I could go to Washington, lock ourselves in a room and get a lot done and create some magic. That, unfortunately, we're policy people. We're not elected officials. So I think we have 2 problems, one political and one cultural. In order to revitalize the role of government, one, I think we need to take our democracy back. We have got to get money out of politics. And I'll give you one example where the United States was desperate for a shot in the arm of economic recovery funds. And millions of people lost their homes, they lost their jobs. We saw the largest contraction in wealth besides the Great Depression. And we had a political elite system that was instead saying, no, we need to actually work on the deficit. There is much more commonality among American people than there is between the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. The American people want public investment in infrastructure. They actually want us to be borrowing right now because it would be really cheap to borrow and we would get that money back, and people understand that. But we have a political system right now where the bidding of private interests, corporate interests, comes before public interest. It funds the campaigns. We now have a political system where unlimited amounts of money are flowing, where you have shadowy organizations that crop up every 4 years, every 2 years in highly contested midterm races, where donors don't have to be disclosed, where you can basically run attack ads that shred the truth, are full of falsehoods, and that's okay. We've had, I think, 11 Supreme Court rulings that have made it nearly impossible for us to get our arms back around our democracy and say that no, spending money in an election is not the same as free speech, and that political equality actually is something we should be able to protect by limiting the amount of money in our electoral system. So I think money in politics is a major barrier to democracy working and actually serving the will of the people, because the will of the people want childcare, they want paid family leave, they want a better tunnel. I took the Lincoln Tunnel here. My commute this morning on the subway system was terrible. So there's a lot of commonality out there, but we have a real political problem. We have a political illness in our democracy right now, and money is a major, major impediment to the kinds of progress we need to actually recreate conditions of shared prosperity. And I also think we have a cultural problem, which I would be happy to also talk about, which isn't completely disconnected from the political problem.
Rhoda, could you ask a question? I think somebody needs to get the questions going because people are being shy. Oh, here's a question.
Okay, but I'm going to just speak loudly. You can't hear me. Maybe you can read it. That.
Stand up, yeah.
Okay, so the question that I have is, and it kind of ties into what you were saying, is the media also, I think, is a factor. So I'm curious about what you think policy-wise, what can the government do to help our media be more accurate and not lie, loud lies to occur?
Peter, that's a question for you.
I'll take a crack at that.
Please.
I am a member of the news media. That means
Yay! Let's
that means
applaud
I'm
Peter.
an enemy of the
people.
Like anything else, media is a plural word, and there are many different news media, good and bad. I think that Bloomberg is among the good ones. Thank you. We try to be accurate. We make mistakes, but when we do, we correct them, and they're certainly not deliberate. The government does not have a role in making the news media accurate, except enforcing things like libel laws. If you libel someone, then you should be brought to account. If you steal secrets, if you commit crimes, then a reporter should not be have some sort of absolute protection from the First Amendment. I mean, you got to behave responsibly. But I don't accept the premise of the question that we should be thinking, what can government do to make the news media more accurate? Because I don't think if we're talking about where the lies are coming from, they're not coming from the media, they're coming from the people that the media are reporting on. But yeah, you want to follow up, so please, love to hear more.
I do want to follow up because media for our generation, we get it. We know who we can trust for our sources, but the younger generation, that's a whole other situation. They're going for sound bites.
Yeah.
So there's got to be some journalism
Right.
standards that maybe the government could advise, or policies that would help make the next generation more informed.
Right.
So I have.
Oh, good. Oh, good. I'm so
Yeah.
glad that you guys want to jump in. Nicole.
I'm actually not going to argue for government to do that role and point to another place where we have leverage, and that is corporations. So there has been a lot of effective advocacy to get corporations to pull their ad dollars from outlets that are doing really destructive things, whether it's Breitbart, whether it's Fox News. Listen, the reality is numerous studies have been done that Fox News has led to a lot of civic breakdown because people are being told falsehoods. The majority of Republicans believed that Obama was not born in this country because of Fox News, because of Breitbart. So if you want, that's not government's job. We never want government to censor the media. And in fact, the media needs to actually be our major watchdog when it comes to politics and government. Corporations that are keeping these news outlets that are based on falsehoods and inflaming terrible rhetoric should be the target for your advocacy. They should stop supporting outlets that aren't committed to democracy and to truth, and to civic education.
Nicole?
I just had a question for you. I was curious, and I'm sorry to put you on the spot, and who would you say that you can trust in your generation?
Bloomberg, for one. National Public Radio, national. MSNBC, Rachel Maddow and Chris Hayes, and all, they're doing the investigative work, the New York Times, the Post, there are news sources that I think do a great job. My concern, though, is that when again, doing the deeper dive into the details, we aren't requiring educational institutions to teach civics and to teach media and how to assess, are you getting what you are paying for, or even if you're not paying for it. So I do think that there's a role in government, even if it's just to educate people about the media.
Okay. Please, would you like to ask a question?
Yes, I wanted to go back to the money and politics issue, which the Supreme Court rulings that we have so far, I think in order to really address the problem, we've got to take another case to the court.
Yep.
And I think that case should be built on the fact that money in politics is depriving us of representative government. Money in politics determines who I get to vote for, even who I can vote for in the primary.
Absolutely.
So,
Thank you. Great question. Money in politics distorts the entire pipeline of the political system. Who gets to run, who wins, what policy agenda is on the table. There's a great set of political science researchers actually here in New Jersey, I think at Princeton, Larry Bartels and I'm forgetting the other person's name. They've done a lot of research showing the role of money in our political system and have found that basically the majority of Americans have little to no influence over the decisions that are being made in the halls of Congress. And when there is a debate on economic policy between what the affluent donor class wants and what everyday middle and working class people want, the affluent class wins every single time. So no wonder people are upset, right? I agree with you. We need to take another case to the Supreme Court. Would have been really great if Obama had gotten to appoint his right to that vacant Supreme Court seat, which was his to appoint. And that was thievery and robbery. And talk about the media falling down, was never really called that. Talk about cultural norms breaking down, that's a big one. The fact that we completely allowed that system of nominating a Supreme Court justice to not happen because of politics is really quite stunning in terms of our democracy. So yes, we need to bring in a new case, but it's not going to work with the justices we have because money in politics has broken down on pretty ideological grounds and partisan grounds. And the troubles don't start with Citizens United. They start in 1976 with a case called Buckley-Vallejo, where the court said that money was a form of free speech, therefore constitutionally protected.
yes. And how can...
So the thing we can do, in the absence of like new Supreme Court, which, you know, I'm still holding out for, public financing. we can move to public financing of elections in our cities and in our states. That is within the Constitution. New York City has a very robust public financing program. It is beginning to change who can run for office, the kinds of issues that actually get debated in the city council and passed. So public financing is one robust option we have right now.
Did you want to follow up?
Well, I just wanted to quote what I often say, is that we're the only civilized country in the whole world where you can bribe your elected officials, you can do it anonymously, and you can take a tax deduction for it as a business. And one other point I would like to make, which maybe sounds crazy, but this program tonight, the role of government, I would love to see in our schools, instead of opening the day with the Pledge of Allegiance, which I understand is written by a socialist, with "We the people," in order to form a more perfect union. Yeah.
Love it. You just gave me goosebumps. Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
I have some questions about the education issue, which I think also is a problem.
Get closer to the mic.
Yeah, is this better?
Yes.
When you make comparisons between our country and other countries, how many of them are committed in the way that we committed long ago to educate every citizen? I mean, that doesn't happen in France. It doesn't happen in Japan. There are processes by which students are kind of sent in many directions. And it is not assumed that every student will get the same, they have to earn it.
Are you talking about higher education or
No,
K through
I'm
12?
not, I'm talking about, I'm talking about education, sort of once a student gets to middle school, there's a differentiation process and they study hard, okay, in order to make the grade to advance if they so choose. But we were committed that every student must be in school, okay, and it's a different philosophy. And I think that in some ways it has undermined our democracy because the schools are failing in part because there's no real sense of why you need to be here. And that if you aren't doing your job in school, you're out on your ear. Does that make sense to you? You know, I think we have a different philosophy here about education than in other countries because we are very different from other countries.
I'm going to say something, even though this is not my area of expertise. Those countries you mentioned France and Japan in particular, do have universal education through high school. Now, they do tracking.
As do we.
Yeah. So that some people may be put on an academic track and some on a vocational track, but there is the idea that everybody should be finishing school up through high school.
And if they don't show up, what happens?
Just like here.
I mean,
Truant officers come out?
truant officer, yeah. I mean,
Okay,
Yeah.
well,
And, you know, it's pretty funny. We actually allow kids to drop out. You know, once you're, depending on the state, 16, 17, or 18, you're allowed to drop out of high school and not complete your studies. So most people track the United States being the first to require K through 12 compulsory, like it's legally required that you get a K through 12 education as being one of the main reasons why we became so an economic powerhouse. And, you know, the founders talked a lot about education as being central to democracy.
I think that is true, and I certainly do agree with that, but I think that the idea that people can go in and say, it's my right to be here, whether or not I perform, whether or not I do what I need to do, my spot, my seat is reserved for me. And so there's not an accountability.
It's really funny. I have the complete opposite impression.
Okay.
I think far too many young people in this country do not feel that they are entitled to that seat at all. And in fact, everything in society tells them they don't belong there, and we don't give a damn if they stay and get educated. I really think that that is the bigger problem that this is one thing that George Bush, W. Bush said that really resonated with me, and one of the few things I really agreed with him on when he talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations. I think that is the huge problem in our country, that we do not expect all from all and the highest potential from everybody, and we give up really pretty easily on a lot of young people in this country.
Yeah.
I think that everybody here would like to see more money going into infrastructure and into education. But how do you do that in a country where everybody I know thinks they're paying too much taxes now? You cannot get people, I mean, how do you convince people that taxes are necessary for a civilized society? They don't believe it.
Yeah, and
Great question.
each of these speakers has addressed that in a very interesting way. Or Tamara emphasized the racism, the appeal to racism, and Nicole emphasized the denigration of the competence of government. Those are not mutually exclusive arguments, but I think what you're asking is how do you get past those two problems and any others there might be? I mean, do you have thoughts about that?
Well, on infrastructure, we may disagree on this. I actually don't think we need to raise taxes. I think we should be borrowing. I think we should actually increase the deficit and the debt to invest in infrastructure, because we're going to make that money back, and it is kind of foolish actually that we're not borrowing right now to make those investments.
Nicole? Just 1 second while she answers this last one, and then we'll go to you.
No, I have no problem with borrowing for infrastructure, but I think there's an issue with the mix of government spending and the definitions both of infrastructure and what we spend government money on in general, particularly at the state and local level. If you look at Connecticut, New York, New Jersey, all three have a pretty hefty, progressive state-level income tax. And if in New York City, to take an extreme example, 34,000 families in New York City pay half of New York City's $8 billion in personal income taxes that come in every year. Now, obviously, that's because they also make the money. But we have progressive income taxes at the state level in these three states, and we have a progressive federal income tax as well. But Connecticut is broke, and this is the richest state in the country and the highest taxed state in the country. Why are they broke? Public pension costs and public retiree health costs have contributed a big portion of this in close to bankrupting the state. The state can't legally go bankrupt, but it can come pretty close to it. In structural problem in that states and cities promised these pension and retiree health care benefits back in the 50s when it was going to be a long time away that they actually had to pay them out. You remember the old Seinfeld, you can take a reservation for a car. The hard part is actually having the car there when the person shows up for it. They promised these pensions that today, with life expectancy where it is really hard for New York, which is doing very well, to have a public safety officer retire after 22 years and get a pension of $60,000 every year for the next 40 years or even longer. Life expectancy has gone up. Healthcare costs have gone up tremendously, and New York pays for its retiree healthcare rather than ask them to take the money out of their pension and buy Medicare, which is what everyone does on Social Security. So varying degrees of problems in these three states and of fiscal health. But the pension and healthcare costs have just shot up so that they are taking from our ability to pay for infrastructure. And so I don't think a lot of people are sitting around saying, gee, my taxes are so low in New Jersey or New York or Connecticut. It's just, what are we spending this tax money on? And some of this is union power and unions being able to affect election outcomes, not illegally, but in very low turnout elections like the one we saw in New York City. In New York State, Cuomo has never wanted to antagonize unions by even doing what Massachusetts did, which is take out healthcare costs from the collective bargaining process. Even Christie, he posited himself as, oh, he's going to go fight the unions. Well, he didn't. He did a deal with the Port Authority police union ahead of his reelection. This is a place where Port Authority police should be put into New York City police, state police, other entities that exist to do this job. And this is not to say that the people who don't do these jobs do a good job in many cases, but this is an inefficient boondoggle in how it's set up. And these costs, as they've ballooned, they harm our ability to invest in the future because we're paying for the past. And I don't mean to pick on New Jersey because we're here, but New Jersey really is broke. I mean, the pension funds are 40% funded. They're going to start to run out of money in 5 years. And so I'm not sure where they think they're going to get it, and they can't raise the state income tax. People can go to a different state. The federal income taxes, you can raise them as a practical matter, if not an ideological one, but it doesn't bring in enough money to pay for everything that we've promised and things that we have to do at the national level. And so we're really talking about middle class tax increases. The middle class actually pays very little in federal tax. They pay a lot in state and local taxes. But I'm not sure that people realize the level of taxation that we need to do these things, that it's not just a matter of, oh, we'll close the hedge fund loophole or we'll raise taxes on the rich. You can do that, but it doesn't buy very much. If we want a lot more government spending, whether on good things, bad things, or used well or wasted, taxes are going up a lot. And yes, we can borrow now because interest rates are very low, but someday they won't, and so they won't be. So you've got to raise taxes then to cover the borrowing that you did in the past. And right now we're not prioritizing that spending very well.
So I'm not a politician, so I can say this because you don't have to vote for me. We should be raising taxes on the middle class. Let me be very clear about that. The United States, people in the United States are not overtaxed by pretty much any definition you look at. At a national level, the amount that we take in from taxes, corporate and individual, as a share of our economy, of our GDP, there are only 2 other nations who take in less revenue than we do as a share of GDP. So that's the complete tax picture. Are we overtaxed? How much of our GDP? The 2 nations that bring in less revenue from taxes than the United States are Chile and Mexico. We are not overtaxed. And when in the Economic Recovery Act and the Bush middle class tax cuts, did polls of middle class people to ask them, did they get a tax cut? Most people had no idea they had received a tax cut. And here's why. The middle class is big. When you cut taxes like $300, $400 a year for the middle class, that is serious money because there's a lot of middle class people in this country. From a pocketbook standpoint, it's actually not that noticeable to the individual. And it's been documented. People are getting tax cuts, don't even know it. We have to pay for these things as a society. That's the reality. We are not overtaxed, and that has been one of the great hoodwinks of our political debate for the last generation. We aren't investing in ourselves because we keep saying we got to cut our taxes. And we're saying that largely by saying we're wasting it on people who don't deserve it. That's been the main argument to drive the tax revolts in this country, is that my tax dollars are paying for them to get something good. And that has been used to destroy this is the cultural problem I'm talking about, to destroy that sense that we are all in it together. Like, remember Barack Obama's 2004 speech where, like, I care, I have a stake that kids in Alabama have clean water, that kids in Flint, we have a whole generation of children in Flint poisoned by lead in 2016 because they wanted to search for a cheaper way to provide clean water. then get real about the cost of a civilized society in this country. And we have to talk about it. I really disagree, and politicians have to quit. Nicole's exactly right. We can't just do this by taxing the rich. The rich should be paying a lot more, but so should everybody.
All right.
And now I can never run for office because I'm on record.
Let me say that I agree about the pension stuff. I mean, a lot of those deals really should never have been made and were just done because it didn't cost anything today, but pushed the can down. But as far as taxes go, I think we have to look at corporate taxes. Let's take a case in point, Apple. Apple did this deal called the Irish two-step. Under U.S. law, a company is domiciled where it's incorporated. Under Irish law, a company is domiciled where the bulk of its activities and facilities are. What all multinational companies do now is they set up subsidiaries in some low-tax area like Ireland. They give all their intellectual property at obviously an inflated low cost to that entity, and then they essentially pay fees to use it. So that has the result of pushing all the income out of this country and into a place where it won't be taxed. Now, because the Irish law says that where the bulk of Apple's facilities are is where the company is, and because under U.S. law, the place where it's incorporated is where the company is, they paid no tax at all.
Yep.
So if you look at the rate overall, because they did pay a little tax here and there, Apple, which is one of the richest companies in the world, paid $50 for every $1 million of income they made. So, I mean, that's ridiculous.
That's
and
a
that's
great
what every
point.
single multinational company in this country does.
And back to this being a political problem, though, what is the political debate we're having about corporate taxes right
Oh,
now?
we're going to lower them.
Exactly.
That's right. No, you're absolutely right. I'll go even further. Now, we have that deal in Wisconsin where they did this great thing with
Foxconn.
Foxconn, $3 billion they're going to pay and that's just a beggar thy neighbor policy, because you have every state in the United States basically offering to cut the taxes for these companies, and that money's got to be made up. I had a company here in the United States. We were just a domestic company. I only had American employees. I had to pay at the top rate. I didn't have a multinational entity that I could offload it on. And these guys, they all had good jobs. I got nothing. These guys, basically they're just ripping us off. I'm fed up about the whole thing, really.
Yeah.
So
A lot of people are fed up.
I'd like to see a show of hands on the issue that Tamara raised a couple minutes ago. And I'm going to ask how many people think personal, let's say go to personal, not corporate, personal income taxes on the middle class are too high, and how many think they're too low? And if you think they're about right, you don't get a chance to answer. You have to. So how many people think that? I'll start with two.
you have to be more specific. What do you mean by middle class?
Okay, let's say from the median household income in this country is like high 50,000s now. So I'll go from 30 up to 200. How's that?
That's too big of a range. Too big of a range. Let's make it 56 to 150.
But once you do 56, then you're into people. You're already starting from the median on up.
Right.
Okay.
I'm starting at the median.
Okay. So we'll take here. 56 to what did you say?
Like 125.
Okay. So 50. How many?
Federal income tax.
Federal. How many people think the federal income tax burden? Forget about just rates, but just the overall tax burden on people from sort of the median on up to 125,000 in family household income. How many people think the tax burden is too low? Okay. And how many think it's too high? Okay. So there's the lows slightly outnumber the highs, but most people just don't want it. Okay, how many think it's about right? Okay. Well, that's Nicole was what she was raising before. But the problem is that any given day, you don't get a chance to say, I want the money spent better. Nicole, I'm sure you have something to say about this.
And a lot of
If
it's
the answer
hidden.
becomes, well, I don't want to pay because the government's going to waste it, you're kind of in a chicken and egg kind of problem.
Yeah, I think this goes back to Tamara's point that if people don't feel like they have a stake in the government, then they don't support the government. And on the corporate tax issue, I think the rate should be lowered so that it's competitive with the rest of the OECD, but use to pay for that, if you will, you do have to figure out a much better way to tax companies who have no real assets. Apple, Uber doesn't make any profit anyway, so we should be paying them, I guess. But Google, Facebook do make profits, and yes, they're not doing anything illegal, but they are well, in Ireland they probably were, but they are exploiting a system that was not set up for these type of companies where you can deduct the cost of the patents and the intellectual properties and so forth in the lowest tax jurisdiction. So lower the rate, and Europe is thinking about charging these companies, for example, by revenue that they book in the country rather than by the net profit that they report. Because the only people who are paying the full rate are people who don't have 1,000 of the best educated accountants and lawyers to find every single one of these loopholes.
Can I ask you a question, Nicole? One of the debates about corporate income taxes is let's lower the rate, which is and close all the loopholes, right? So if we lower the rate to 15%, at least GE and Apple would at least pay 15% instead of 0%. But there seems to be a real disagreement about whether that has to be revenue neutral or we can actually my goal is we need more corporate revenue overall. We need to be raising more revenue from corporate taxes. If we can raise more revenue with a lower rate, I'm fine with that. But that's not the proposal I hear connected to lowering the rate. It's actually, let's lower the rate and make sure that we take in no more revenue as a percentage from corporations.
Yeah, if it works right, and who knows if it will or not, a lower corporate rate should bring in more revenue.
Well, I've written about this too. The big problem now is, as the guy up here pointed out, that corporations, to avoid the 35% rate in the U.S., are holding their profits abroad. And if we went to a different kind of tax system, which was not the one about, the U.S. has a system of taxing companies for their worldwide profits. If we got rid of that and went to a territorial system, which is a system that every other country in the world has, with appropriate safeguards, we could make more money with a lower rate, because the money wouldn't be held offshore the way it is now.
Yep.
We got a lot of questions all of a sudden, which is great. Why don't you go first? Could you go to the mic, please?
As a matter of policy, and on the subject of taxes, how do you feel about the mortgage interest rate deduction? How do you feel about the mortgage interest rate deduction?
Me?
As a matter
Both?
of the panel, as a matter of public policy, is it a distortion or is it a great thing? I'd like to know your opinion.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it is a distortion. It's one of the biggest distortions in our economy, and this goes to a larger point, which is that people seem to want to have a free market economy, but in most areas of the economy that are important, like buying a house or not buying a house, there is no free market. It is a completely government-created and distorted market. That the mortgage interest tax deduction, if you are concerned about the environment, this rewards you for buying the biggest house you can afford or can't afford. It pushes up people's debt. If you want to subsidize something, if you want to get more of something, you subsidize it. So we massively subsidize mortgage debt. The mortgage debt is now $10 trillion, and this pushed people out of urban areas into newer suburbs back in the 50s and 60s because it seemed wonderful. You could have a new house, a yard, and so forth, just for going half an hour away from your place of work. Now, a lot of the mortgage interest tax deduction didn't cause some of these problems, but it certainly made them much worse. And the government should be counter-cyclical. If everyone is rushing out to live in the suburbs or to buy a big house, government shouldn't help them in doing that. It should put some kind of minor obstacle in their way, but instead people are able to deduct this cost of borrowing from their taxes. Now, people say, well, that you're going to raise my taxes if you take away the mortgage interest tax deduction. Your taxes are not lowered because of this. The government is paying you to engage in a behavior that the government likes, which is for you to go deeply into debt to buy a large suburban house. If we change the tax mix, you could certainly take the money that you gain from getting rid of the mortgage interest deduction and use that as a tax credit. You could send a check to every American. You could send it to people who make under a certain amount. There are many ways of doing it, but unlike with the corporate tax, the goal shouldn't be more taxes. It should be get rid of this distortive behavior and give that money back to people in the form of a different type of tax cut.
So I think Nicole and I agree here, but for different reasons. I do think the mortgage interest deduction is a bit of a boondoggle. So I'm a class interloper. I grew up working class. Neither of my parents had college degrees. And I'm now, most people don't like to admit their class status. So I'll say I'm professional upper middle class. I live in Park Slope, Brooklyn, for God's sakes, and I own my apartment, all 900 square feet of it. And the first year after we bought our place, when we got our taxes done, and I saw the amount of money that we got because we had the money to buy a really expensive apartment in Park Slope, Brooklyn, actually made me really upset.
You were the only person who felt that.
There are so many, and this is where it gets back to what are our taxes paying for? So much of our taxes are paying for hidden benefits to those who don't need them in the form of the mortgage interest deduction, the lion's share of which goes to people that make good incomes and have big mortgages. The second thing is retirement benefits through the tax code. Also, the richer you are, the more tax break you get. And so I think it's a gigantic boondoggle. I think we need to spur development in more dense housing, in more affordable housing, and more rental housing. So yeah, it's a travesty, and it is not chump change. It is a serious amount of our tax dollars that are going to reward people with very hefty mortgages, particularly on the coasts.
Okay, there were several questions up in here. Yes, sir.
Just a quick comment on the mortgage. If we do away with the mortgage reduction, the value of your apartments will fall. You might be happy about that since you like it when the taxes got higher. My real question had to do with taxing corporations versus taxing individuals. I mean, there's been a general political trend, I think, in the U.S. to say we're going to tax corporations, even if it's only superficial, because in the end, as Gene said, it may not be happening that way, but push the tax to corporations and tax individuals less. Do you think that makes good economic sense?
Well, I can jump in on that one.
I'm going to let you
I just
jump
want to
in
say,
first.
is there that divide?
The share of total federal revenue coming from corporate tax has been falling as companies have gotten better and better at finding ways not to pay it. There's no theoretical ideal share, except that if there are people who would say, why do we need a corporate tax? Because after all, corporations are owned by individuals. Why not just have the tax paid at the individual level by the people who receive the dividends and the capital gains? Which sounds at first blush, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it's a legal fiction. Why should it be taxed at that level? The problem is that if you did that, then people would rearrange their financial affairs to become a corporation. You know, lawyers already have these things, doctors, personal corporations, and then they would pay themselves a salary from the personal corporation, and they would keep the money in the corporation. They would find ways to shield the money so it would never get taxed. That's why we have a corporate tax.
But if you have a corporate tax, then the corporations, if they're paying the corporate tax, are going to raise consumer prices to adjust for that tax and presumably to pay a margin on top of it.
Right, so there's this whole school of thought about tax incidence. Who ends up bearing the tax? It's not always the one who technically pays it. But the idea is that the tax would fall, a corporate tax falls at least somewhat on the shareholders and of the company versus the consumers, who of course there's overlapping groups. Let's get more people involved here. Somebody who hasn't said anything yet? Yes?
Yeah, my question is, first of all, I just wanted to say that what I heard Mark saying is about a redistribution of wealth, okay? And there's a lot of attitude that has to change. And I keep thinking about people getting what they wish for when they say, get government out of my life. I wish it was It's a Wonderful Life version of what would happen if you had no roads, no sewer, no military, all these things, and public health. And then there's the idea that people need to understand that you got to balance right tide lifts all boats versus I want to decide how I spend my money. I give to charity and I pick the charities I want to give to. And there may be all the people that you're talking about, but I make that decision. So how do you convince people as a whole, unless there's like a war, that we all are in this together and that we have to do something about it? How do you do that?
Tough one.
By saying exactly what you said, reminding people of that. So Demos actually had done quite a bit of, we've done quite a bit of research on how you actually talk about government with people. And when you remind people, like I did when I started my talk, about what the government helped build in this country and remind people of the hidden structures of government, our court system, our roads, our bridges, our schools, your mortgage interest deduction, your retirement savings, then you get, there's been a concerted and conservative effort to get people to associate government with welfare, with a very, very small part of government. So that when you hear government, you think food stamps, you think TANF for welfare, and you don't think of all these other things that go into a civilized society. And the reality is, who is it? I think it's Bill Gates's father, talks a lot about how when what a luck of the lottery of birth to be born in America. Yeah, Warren Buffett. You can't get filthy rich like this in a lot of places in the world. So one, you can get filthy rich here because we actually have all these public structures that allow us to have intellectual property, that allow us to have courts of law, that allow us to have systems of logistics and transportation systems and clean water and all of that stuff. That is not possible in a lot of countries in the rest of the world. And so when you make it here, you didn't make it here only alone. You made it here on the backs of all of us contributing to this public system in our democracy. And I think we've lost that memory, right? That is actually what government is. It's not food stamps, although I'm all for helping people feed their families. But government has become a very racialized term. And the debate about government has become highly racialized. And until we unpack that and remind ourselves that the government does lots of things and that it's actually worth contributing to, I don't think we stand a chance.
Well, it goes back to what my friend said. You've got to start with the kids. You have to teach civics. You have to explain to them how the government works. You got to put it in the school system because it's too late for the rest of us. The ones who are voting are already ruined.
Can I give you a great example? I love this story. So I'm on Twitter. I'm not that great. @Tamara Drought, if anybody in here. So do people know who Grover Norquist is? Okay. The anti-tax crusader. So I'm on Twitter. He tweets how a Republican is born. Daughter saved up $100 for first guitar, dun dun dun, sales tax, didn't have enough money. I tweeted, and could not have happened at an odder time when my daughter actually literally asked me, why do we pay taxes? And I was like, well, really? Let me tell you. And I tweeted back at him, actually, you pay those taxes so that we have good stuff in our society, like schools and courts and everything. And that's a great lesson to teach a child who's 9, that yes, there is such a thing as sales tax, and here's why we pay it. But in his mind, that's how a Republican is born. And I'm sure he had a very different conversation with his daughter than I had with my 9-year-old daughter about the role of sales taxes and why a $50 pair of shoes isn't just $50.
I just want to say to your idea that it's about civics, both of you kind of made that point. If it were as simple as just saying, here are the facts, and you learn these facts, then you'll agree with me, then, problem would have been solved many years ago. The problem is motivated reasoning. People have their objectives in mind. They've already made their conclusions, and they're just looking for evidence to support it. And that's just true on the left and the right. We all do it. So this idea that we have this elixir called education that solves all problems, unfortunately not. Right here.
I have another worry about this whole issue of taxes, and that's government debt. We've just passed $20 trillion in government debt, and I'm just wondering, whether my worry about that is valid, and how long this is going to go on before the day of reckoning comes, and the government may actually go bankrupt.
Yeah.
I would be more worried about private sector debt in that, and also, why has the government been able to go into so much debt, and the investors all around the world are willing to lend the U.S. money for less than 2%. I think it's a little bit above 2% now, but over the past couple of years, it was less than 2% in annual interest, that nobody is expecting any inflation. To look ahead 30 years and say inflation is going to be below 2%, and also I don't want any real return on my investment is a worrisome sign. And so how did this situation come about? For 35 years, it has been the policy of the U.S. to mask stagnant wage incomes, and not the stated policy, no one ran on this, with more borrowing. So if I was working at a factory in the 1980s and it got to be 1990 and my real income hadn't gone up at all, that was fine because I could borrow on a credit card, much easier to do. And back in the 70s, you had to be someone who didn't need to borrow before you could even get a credit card. And if I had bought a house, the value of my house was going up, so I could take money out of my house and use that to supplement my income. And people don't think of it that way, but if you go through the year, you pile up $5,000 worth of credit card debt, you think, I'm not too happy with this, so I'll refinance my house. And guess what? Interest rates went down, so I can refinance my house, and I'll use the money I save to pay off that credit card debt, and then I bought myself another year. And we did this from the early 80s until 2008. And in mortgage debt just between 2000 and 2008 went from 5 trillion to 10 trillion. So after 2008, we doubled down on this same strategy and pushing interest rates down even lower so people could keep borrowing. So more people could be enticed to buy a house so that the price of houses wouldn't fall too much. And keeping interest rates down is a way of bailing out people who already owned houses that had a lot of value and people who are already in debt. And so this reliance on debt and delay of dealing with the problems that were created when the entire world opened up and became competition to us, and everyone behind the Iron Curtain, China, everyone, suddenly we were all competing for the same jobs. We've actually started talking about this problem over the past few years, not in amazingly healthy ways, but at least we're discussing it. But from the 80s until 2008, very few people talked about it at all. And so we had low growth, and the answer to this was keep interest rates down, keep borrowing. And I'm not sure how long that could go on. Maybe it could go on for a very long time. It certainly has, but you would think at some point the amount of debt that we've amassed, the amount of debt that China has amassed itself in really trying to do a slightly different version of the same thing, in borrowing to build massive amounts of infrastructure that it doesn't really need right now. What happens if and when all of this cheap debt goes away? So I'd have maybe made you more worried, but federal debt is maybe the least important problem of all of this private sector debt and other global debt.
Let's see, let me ask Peggy.
Okay, so I'm actually going to be switching the topic a little bit here, and what I'm asking may actually be an unanswerable question. I'm interested in somebody making me feel less queasy about the notion of public and private partnerships, particularly in building our infrastructure. If the role of the government is to maximize general welfare, yet corporations are out there to maximize profit, I have been hearing this term for decades now. You hear it federally, you hear it at the state and local level. I've even heard it at local home and school meetings. So the notion that we're going to have public-private partnerships come in and build the infrastructure we need when they have fundamentally different purposes or goals. Can you give me examples where this really has worked, or, allay my concern that it's political rhetoric, that there's no realistic way to expect that to happen? Okay.
Well, I think part of the problem is what is a public-private partnership. If you look at how cities fill in potholes, they don't do it themselves. They hire private contractors who bid on this work, and the contractors come out in the middle of the night and fill in the potholes and go home. And they do that not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because they want to make a profit. And so this can work well in that this work can be seasonal. If you have to build a school, you don't want to hire a team of permanent construction workers for 30 years and be responsible for their benefits and so forth over those 30 years if you only have to do this once every 5 years. And so it makes sense to hire a contractor, go out, get bids, pick the one with the best bid, and go forward like that. Now, there's many instances when that doesn't work very well, and you have corruption and projects poorly done and so forth. But it is a profit motive, and the government is trying to harness that profit motive, even though it's not called a public-private partnership. I think the problem with it is when you do employ the term for much more complex projects, and it's not well defined what is the private sector's job and what is the government's job. If I've got a pothole to fill in and I say, I'm going to pay you $500 to do this work tonight, I feel like I've gotten a good deal. I've gotten it done. I've kept my costs predictable and short term. Maybe there was a better way to go about it, but this seems to be working all right. But if I want to privatize my subway system and hire a private contractor to bid on managing, operating, and maintaining that subway system for 30 years. London tried to do this. There's just so much more that can go wrong. The private sector can underestimate or overestimate the cost of the work, or the time it will take to do the work, or how complicated the work is. If the private sector gets an estimate off for 1 year, that compounds over all of the years of the contract. What happens if the private sector has underestimated it? eventually they're going to walk away from the contract because it's not worth it for them anymore to pile up all of these losses. And that's exactly what happened in London. What happens if they overestimate it? Then the government is overpaying for something it doesn't need to overpay for many, many years, not just on one contract. So much like charter schools, this can work well when it's well-defined and more short-term than long-term, because the government's priorities change too. If you sign a 30-year contract to have a private company operate a portfolio of schools, 30 years from now, your town could be bigger, it could be smaller. If you have to close schools, open schools, you're going to have to pay off these private contractors. And we've seen that problem in Europe as well. Where can it work well? Say I've got 10 bus routes that I want to contract out. They're well defined. You have to provide a certain level of service every so many minutes or so forth. Your driver has to be trained and certified. You have to have a bus that's younger than 5 years old. Define all of these things in the contract and do something like 3-year bids. Where if your contractor doesn't work out, you're not stuck with it for 30 years. You can rebid it in 3 years. And so I think it can work, but short-term, well-defined, and where there isn't a lot of construction and other types of risks where the private sector doesn't like to take on, and if it does take them on, they're going to overcharge you because of the uncertainty. So something like the LaGuardia Airport project is being done by a private group of companies that will build, maintain, and operate the airport. That's a longer-term deal, and things could still go wrong with it, but it is well-defined in what they are supposed to do and what the government is supposed to do. So, it's one of these things where when government knows what it's doing, it can design these things well. When it doesn't, it can be a big disaster.
Great. Okay. Yes, sir.
Earlier, I believe you said that government was responsible for the middle class. Seems to ignore the fact that in the 50s and 60s, union labor force was probably 27%, and today it's around 7%. And I think unions were responsible for a vibrant.
Indeed. Thank you. In my larger wrap, when I have a chance, I actually talk about how there was sort of a bargain struck between government, unions, and workers, and that framework was in operation and really did help build the middle class. Studies have shown, the Economic Policy Institute has done some good studies that put about attribute about 1/3 of the rise of inequality, income inequality in this country, to the collapse of union density in the percentage of particularly private sector workers that are covered by collective bargaining contracts. There is no doubt that all workers are actually being paid less in the private sector as a result of the decline of unions in this country.
And the lion's share of unionized people now are public sector workers. That's what Nicole was talking about before. I'm going to give a couple seconds, just take maybe, do you want to wrap it up?
No, I don't want to wrap it up.
Okay.
I want to know if you could talk a little bit about regulations, government and regulations, and its role in protecting.
Rhoda's asking, can we talk about regulation?
Right now with
Dodd-Frank. I have Dodd-Frank, as people may know, is the financial regulation law that was passed after the last financial crisis. Sprawling law with many, many parts to it, and some people like some parts and don't like others. Some of the regulations for it are still being spelled out after all these years, and there's a big rearguard action by the financial sector to make those rules as light as possible. But on the whole, I mean, my feeling is that it's probably been a net positive. Throwing some sand in the gears is not always a bad thing if you're discouraging activity. It shouldn't be happening in the first place. Anybody else?
I would just lift up the establishment of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which is under severe, severe attack. I would say right now, with the switch in administrations, it's probably the only agency that's still committed to actually protecting working and middle-class people. And it is under, I think, pretty grave threat. It has returned a lot of money back to people who had it taken, whether through student loan servicing or the Wells Fargo case where they were signing people up for accounts they didn't want or know they even had. So I think the regulatory state is actually really important, and it has been, it's often hidden, but it is often where the rubber hits the road. And from food safety and us not investing in our regulatory bodies of oversight, whether it's the Department of Labor, matters. And we've actually, again, this is a role that government plays that we have actually been operating at a pretty threadbare level in terms of the ability to actually provide accountability. Wage theft is a great example. It's a very common occurrence to not pay workers all they are due, either by not giving them breaks that they're allowed, forcing them to work overtime off the clock and not paying them those wages. And the only way that employers get caught is if it gets reported and then investigated. So again, studies show that employers are robbing their workers of wages in amounts that are greater than that from burglaries in the United States. But our apparatus, our federal government, Department of Labor, is working on a threadbare budget, and every year, all of these agencies who make sure we have clean water and safe chicken and not infected spinach can't do their jobs, frankly. There's just not enough inspectors.
Yeah.
Yes, just-in-time scheduling. It's really, I have a section in my book called On Call, not just for doctors anymore. It's really, all technology can be used responsibly if there's rules in place about how you can use the technology. And you do have states and some cities now beginning to realize that some of our regulations are out of date, and we need to update them and say that if you send a worker home, you actually have to pay for at least half the shift that they were scheduled for, as an example. Because what happens is you have low-wage workers that are taking, 2 buses to get to work. They show up for the shift, the mall isn't busy, and the manager says, bye-bye, we don't need you anymore. You thought you were getting 8 hours of pay, and you get 1. And so states are starting to say, I forget what they're called, it's getting late, that I think it's called fair, anyway, doesn't matter, that if you do that, the employer is still on the hook for 4 hours of pay. Workers are scheduled week to week often. There's no advance notice given. They're often expected to be on call, and when they can't be on call for whatever reason, they get fired if they can't come in when the manager at the restaurant says, we need you tonight. So we have a lot of outdated workplace rules, and a lot of workers falling through the cracks and being treated as disposable.
Okay, I want to wrap it up.
Are we wrapping up?
We're not
Okay.
quite, but I want to get a few last people in before we wrap it.
If I may just comment quickly on Dodd-Frank, just because
sure.
I think it's something we didn't bring up. I think Dodd-Frank is part of the problem, not the solution, because it is so complex that we talked about the role of money in politics, but the role of information in politics is just as important, arguably more important. Dodd-Frank is a 600-page law, but the regulations and rules that Dodd-Frank directs regulatory agencies to create are tens of thousands of pages. The only people who can understand these rules, who can shape them, who can learn how to work within them and work around them, are people who work at large financial institutions, people who used to work for these institutions, and or people who used to work for Congress and helped create Dodd-Frank and then went to go work on the other side, working for the financial institutions, that after the financial crisis, there were a few simple things that needed to be done. The government should have increased capital requirements, meaning the banks cannot borrow more than a certain percentage of their assets. Force financial instruments such as derivatives to trade on exchanges. That gets back to the borrowing issue where they can't, a company like AIG, under regulations that went back to the 1930s, they could never have taken on a $500 billion commitment in derivatives without putting a certain percentage of that down in cash. What would that have meant? The treasurer would have said, wait a minute, we're sending out $50 billion in cash on what? And so they would have had to think about this a lot more carefully than they did. The regulations that we put in place in the 1930s actually worked very well up until the 1980s. The problem is that we didn't apply the same regulations to new types of financial instruments, financial companies, and financial securities. And people said, well, we've structured the security so it's AAA rated, so nothing can happen to it, so we don't have to put any capital behind it. If the government had said, that's wonderful that you did that, but that's not our job to decide whether it works or not. We have uniform capital regulations across financial instruments. You would have had more capital in the financial system, less borrowed money, and the crisis would have been not as bad as it was. As it is, we've got this new law. It did not end too big to fail. It arguably perpetuated too big to fail. And the problem that too big to fail exists to exacerbate is still there. Too much debt in the private economy. Why are the banks too big to fail? Because they are doing the government's job and pushing out all of this consumer debt. You can have superficial changes, and Wells Fargo opens up millions of fake accounts and they say they're sorry and send some money back to the government. But the underlying problem is still there. We are too reliant on consumer debt. These financial firms are too big to fail because they are the engines of this consumer debt. And Dodd-Frank didn't do very much, if anything, to fix those problems. It actually did a few good things on derivatives, but that was a couple of pages. We did not need this level of complexity to accomplish very modest results.
I'm going to go to the very back row there. You, yes, please. No, behind you.
So I was wondering, in your opinion, what are the first steps that should be taken for reform in America?
For
First steps-
reform?
For reform, yes.
Reform.
I'm going to go back to money and politics. It's really funny. You know, when we talk about Dodd-Frank, there were certainly a lot of people who wanted a simpler solution and wanted better, tighter regulations going forward. Our organization was very, yes, exactly, which is rather simple. My organization, Demos, was deeply involved in financial reform, and that was not a fair battle, to state the obvious. Again, the Wall Street banks went after this with everything they had. The consumer advocates were outspent like 100 to 1. The people who hold the sophisticated information are the people that work for the banks, and that revolving door between government regulators and Wall Street is very real. And so that battle was fought mostly about how is this going to impact the banks and less about how is this going to keep all of our paychecks and our retirement savings in our homes safe from exploitation going forward. And that was about money and politics.
All right.
It's also about the fact that corporations are being held responsible, quote unquote, but the people in those corporations who make the decisions
Yep.
are going free.
Yeah. There's not been one court case brought against anybody from any of the financial institutions.
I think the financial crisis is what got us President Trump. The bailouts angered people, whether they were on the right, on the left, in the middle. young people, old people, and people who called themselves supporters of free markets were supporting these bailouts. And the debate was so muddled and unhelpful that if you don't support the financial institutions, then you want a depression. It was unnecessarily binary. People said at the time, if we don't bail them out, we're going to have a bigger problem. Well, guess what? We bailed them out, and we have a pretty big problem. And the social costs and the cultural costs of telling people for 35 years, you are responsible for your own decisions, good and bad. If you've got a small business, if something happens, you're out of luck, no one's going to rescue you. And suddenly the biggest firms in the world with the most sophisticated people and the best paid people at their helms need these massive taxpayer bailouts, and we have absolutely no choice about it. This was a great trauma, and people are still angry about this. Neither mainstream party figured it out. Hillary Clinton, to take money from the financial world after 2008 and think you're going to win the presidency, I mean, that disqualifies her on grounds of mental delusion. That in any world that she thought that, that people were surprised that Trump won. They should have been surprised if Hillary won. She was the Mitt Romney of this election, and none of the other Republican candidates would come out and say these bailouts were wrong. We can never have something like that happen again. And so you get Bernie Sanders and you get Trump, who on economic issues, at least in terms of what they said to different audiences, not in how they said it, but on the populist economic issues. And I don't like the word populist really, because to me that's giving people what they want, which is actually a good thing. But they had very similar economic messages.
All right. We're getting close to wrapping up here. I'll go back there, please.
My main question is, when I first started working back in 1964 for a major corporation, the average CEO pay was 50 times the average worker's pay. It changed immensely over that time. One of the main reasons was there was a change in what you could compensate people on the board for. I don't know what year that took place. I'm thinking the early 80s or late 70s. Whereas the boards that went back, the boards of public corporations, actually represented the shareholders and the people. But they got bought because they were allowed to get higher compensation, special bonuses, stock bonuses, this and everything. So these boards, these corporate boards, just became yes men for running public corporations. That's why part of the inequality in pay is because the people at the top take all the money. These are companies that make a lot of money and companies that make very little. It doesn't matter. It still works out. So somewhere along the line, we derailed, from like maybe 1965, 66, back in time. It was an average 40 to 50 times the CEO pay of the
Yeah, it was actually 25 times.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's now about 300.
Okay. Yes,
And unions.
right here.
I would also add to your analysis that
I would
unions.
just say that I think that Bernie Sanders was an economic populist, while Trump is a political populist. Trump does not blame the corporations for anything. He's blaming government, whereas Bernie Sanders went after corporate America. So I think that is a big difference between the two. I'd also like to add that I recently read a poll, I think it was on Yahoo, and it may have been the Pew poll, I'm not sure. But in this poll, Republican voters were asked whether they thought that the media was more dangerous than the white supremacists who caused the violence in Charlottesville, and 69% of those who responded said that they thought the media was more dangerous than the white supremacists. And I just found that really disturbing.
Okay.
It's a big problem.
Can I make one, are we wrapping up?
Yeah, well, go ahead.
So this is probably the only thing that I will really disagree with Nicole about is that, let's not forget, Obama won re-election after the financial crashes, right? After Dodd-Frank, he was re-elected. There would be no Trump without the first African-American president, period.
I think there are a lot of reasons, and it's complicated, but I would just say Obama won because it's a choice between two people, and the other person was Mitt Romney. And Trump, I'm not here to defend Trump by any means, but if people don't realize the very complex and varied reasons why and how he could win, which they had thought was unthinkable, and I did not think was unthinkable. You can go back 18 months before the election, and I was writing, yes, Trump can win, and this is why, and this is how you can prevent it. And there wasn't, it was thought that Hillary could run a traditional campaign and the Republicans could run a traditional campaign, and that did not work out. But Trump did attack corporations. He was not a traditional Republican sticking up for corporations and saying he's going to cut taxes at the top. He ran a very odd campaign for a Republican or for anyone in any party, and the circumstances that built up over 35 years, including the bailouts, including unhappiness with the Clinton family, for very good reason, it gave us what we have today. Now, there's a lot of problems with Trump and with some of the people who voted for Trump, but I think not thinking through these things carefully and not empathizing with some of the people who felt they had no choice but to vote for Trump, that they were not going to vote for the Clinton family. And this was almost like calling people's bluff. It's you have no choice but to vote for someone whose family took hundreds of millions of dollars from these same corporations because you can't possibly vote for Donald Trump. Well, they took that bluff and they did vote for Donald Trump. And I think if people think they're going to beat Trump by rerunning the 2012 election, they may unfortunately be very surprised again.
Peggy? Okay, well, then I think we should wrap it. I'm going to say on my behalf, before Rhoda does, thank you to both speakers and to the audience. And Rhoda?
Yeah. And I'm going to say, was this not a provocative and interesting evening?
Great questions. Thank you. That does not always happen, and I've been the subject of a lot of Q&As, and I really want to actually applaud you all for the caliber of the conversation we had tonight, so thank you.
Yes, they deserve it. Now, you heard money influence mentioned several times tonight. I hope to see you here November 2nd when we cover all those issues. Good night, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you.
Good night.